Hey guys, tonight we're traveling to a windswept coastline in ancient Greece, where the earth smells of wild thyme and sun-baked stones, and a salty breeze carries stories older than the language you're hearing them in. You're walking down a cracked footpath through Bronze Age Thessaly. Yes, that place Homer liked to name-drop, and the sky above is grumbling with distant thunderclouds. A storm is rolling in, slow and sulky, like a disappointed god on his way to scold mortals for something ridiculous, like an improperly folded bedsheet offering. You pull your cloak tighter around your shoulders, not that it helps much, because it's made of scratchy goat wool and basically designed to insult your skin, and you trudge toward a small, shuttered village nestled at the base of a sloping hill. The olive trees here are gnarled like gossiping old women, whispering secrets to the wind. You're not sure why you're here yet, just that something strange, no, and strain, is about to happen. A few scraggly sheep wander past. One of them gives you a look that says, "You probably won't survive this." Fair enough. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, leave a comment with your location and what time it is right now. I'm always fascinated by where and when you're listening. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've arrived at a time when myths aren't yet myths, they're morning news. In the village square, elders sit on lopsided stools, sharing tales while sharpening olive-pitting stones. One such tale is about the time Zeus, king of the gods and occasional swan impersonator, turned into a swarm of ants. Not a lion, not lightning, not even a majestic eagle. Ants, and not just one for subtlety. Oh no, he went full swarm. But before we dive into the insect impersonation, you watch the sky darken like a bruised plum. People scatter indoors. The storm has more bark than bite, but thunder still growls across the plains like a hangry giant. A young shepherd stumbles past you, muttering about omens. You follow him to a half-collapsed temple, once sacred to someone, probably still sacred to someone else, if the moss growing up its columns is any indicator. Inside, carved on a chipped limestone wall, are a series of tiny figures marching in neat little lines. At first glance, they could be ants, or soldiers, or both. And that's when the local priestess finds you. She's barefoot and muttering something about Myrmidons. "Children of the ant," she says, tapping the wall, "born from the earth by the will of Zeus." You raise an eyebrow, ant people. You've heard worse ideas. One time someone swore a dolphin raised Play-Doh. The priestess begins chanting something low and rhythmic, and you realize this isn't just mythology. It's bedtime mythology, the kind passed down in sleepy chants to tuck in goat-herding children before nightmares about tax collectors. This is how it begins. Once there was a plague, not the sniffle-and-stay-home kind, but the wipe-out-your-whole-village kind. The people of Aegina, an island named after Zeus's latest crush, Aegina, naturally, were wiped out by Hera's divine spite. Hera, in case you've forgotten, is Zeus's long-suffering wife and full-time Thunderbolt accountability officer. She didn't love that Zeus had turned her handmaiden into an island namesake. So the people were gone, all of them, poof. And the local king, Aeacus, who, to be fair, didn't start this drama, was devastated. He prayed to Zeus, not for gold or power, but for people. Someone to cook the barley, herd the sheep, argue over the best place to build a cistern. And Zeus, he looked down and saw ants, a whole hill of them, busy as well ants, and he thought, Historians still argue whether this was an act of mercy, boredom, or just an unfortunate bet with Hermes gone too far. So Zeus took these ants and turned them into people. Human-sized, yes, but still somehow antish, disciplined, obedient, fond of tunnels. They became the Myrmidons, soldiers so precise in formation you'd swear they were choreographed by a neurotic god of synchronized marching. You step back from the temple wall. Outside, the storm has faded to a drizzle, and the cicadas are back at it with their sleepy summer gossip. You lie down on a patch of dry earth, the priestess still murmuring in the background. As the stars start to blink through the misty sky, you think, if you had to be turned into something by a god, maybe ants aren't the worst option. Certainly better than a goose. You wake, though not fully, more like drift, beneath the soft croak of tree frogs and a sleepy breeze threading through the columns of the half-ruined temple. The priestess has wandered off, mumbling something about fermented fig paste and elbow salves. Typical. You sit up slowly and brush imaginary ants off your tunic, because now that you've heard the story, you can't not feel them. Everywhere. crawling just outside your vision, organizing their tiny communities like obsessive homeowners associations. So here's the thing you're beginning to realize. Zeus was a serial shapeshifter. You've probably heard about the swan incident. We don't have to rehash it. Maybe the bull, possibly the shower of gold, which, let's be honest, raises some plumbing questions. But what they never tell you in school is that Zeus got very, very creative, and not always in flattering ways. You trudge toward the coast, where fishing boats bob sleepily on glassy water. There's a fisherman scraping barnacles off his hull who's happy to tell you more, between complaints about the price of olive oil and how the stars aren't where they used to be. You know, he says, Zeus once turned into a cloud, just a regular, puffy, Sunday afternoon kind of cloud, seduced a princess that way. He shrugs. I mean, good for him, I guess. You nod slowly. It's not the strangest thing you've heard today. Historians still debate whether the ant incident was metaphorical or a literal supernatural metamorphosis. Some say Zeus never changed shape at all, that it was all symbolic, ants representing the hard-working ethos of ideal citizens. But let's be honest, this is a guy who once turned into fire. Symbolism isn't really his default setting. You round a bend in the path and find yourself in front of a particularly grand mosaic. The tiles shimmer, even under the dull coastal light, and depict, you guessed it, a swarm of ants swirling upward toward a bearded man in the clouds. His expression is a mix of divine purpose and why did I do this again? The transformation scene is oddly detailed. Some ants still have legs midway through, some already wear sandals and tiny bronze helmets. It's like someone tried to animate evolution using claymation and forgot how knees work. In the distance, thunder growls again, but more like a purr this time. Zeus has clearly calmed down, or maybe he's just watching. You walk on, crunching pebbles underfoot, which suddenly makes you conscious of how much like ants humans are. Scurrying in lines, carrying bundles, tidying up for no reason. You remember something the priestess said. The gods don't make mistakes, they just don't always explain the punchlines. There's something charmingly anticlimactic about this whole myth. Zeus doesn't destroy a city. He doesn't throw lightning. He just stares at a hill of ants, nods approvingly, and decides they'll make great citizens. Imagine the meeting on Olympus. Hermes, you're making what out of ants? Zeus, soldiers, very polite ones. Ares, do they bleed? Zeus, not if I don't program that feature. Hera, I roll audible from Mount Ida. You settle beneath a laurel tree and let the story loop again in your mind. The shape-shifting, the swarm, the silence that comes with divine transformation. Some scholars whisper about a lost variant of the myth, where Zeus didn't just turn ants into people, but turned himself into ants first. A whole swarm, collectively divine, crawling among humanity to better understand them. It's deeply weird and somehow comforting. After all, gods walking in mortal shoes is one thing, but crawling in tiny little ant sandals, that's dedication. You watch a real ant climb a stalk of fennel beside you. It pauses, antennae twitching, then continues its journey, undeterred, focused, oddly regal. Maybe that's the heart of the myth, not war, not transformation, but a gentle nod to the tiniest workers who carry empires on their backs, unnoticed beneath the sandals of gods. The trail leads you inland now, through scrubby hills dotted with fig trees and suspiciously symmetrical anthills. A cicada whines somewhere nearby, nature's version of elevator music, and you find yourself wondering what it must have been like, back then, to stumble across a civilization seeded by insects. The land of the Myrmidons, they called it, a patch of sun-blasted soil where ants once crawled in and humans marched out. These weren't just any humans, of course, they were Zeus-crafted ant-ascended warriors. The name itself, Myrmidon, practically buzzes with the root word for ant, Myrmex if you're into that sort of thing. And according to every sleep-deprived vase painter in the region, they lived in Phthiades, part of Thessaly, where Achilles would eventually be born. Yes, that Achilles. But we'll get to him later. He's still gestating in the future. For now, you're standing in their homeland, and there's a dry wind dragging its fingers across the fields. You spot a half-buried tablet near a crumbling shrine. Its carvings show straight-backed men in tidy rows, every shield identical, every helmet symmetrical. The kind of military neatness that screams either divine design or obsessive-compulsive ants. Probably both. You pick up a chunk of reddish pottery. A faint black line curls across its surface, part of a six-legged creature mid-transformation. Someone once thought this was important enough to immortalize in clay, possibly while high on pomegranate wine. The Myrmidons were said to be unflinchingly loyal, never broke rank, and marched without complaint. Sound familiar? That's because it's basically every ant you've ever seen. If you were to walk into a Myrmidon camp, let's say you're invited, no sneakiness, you'd find order bordering on eerie, cooking fires in exact squares, sandals lined up like museum exhibits, probably no laughing. Possibly one person in charge of counting how many sesame seeds fell out of the flatbread. Historians still argue whether the myth of the Myrmidons was a cultural reflection of military discipline, or a handy origin story for why Achilles and his crew fought like they shared one collective brain cell. Either way, it stuck. And it's not just the neatness, it's the loyalty. Ants are famously all in. No hesitation, no mutiny. The colony acts as one. When Aeacus, that lonely king who begged Zeus for help, saw the ants transform, it wasn't just about getting new citizens. He was getting a metaphor for unity, for people who stick together even when someone drops honey on the floor. There's a spot just ahead where an old amphora is half sunk into the earth. Inside, nestled among dry roots, is what looks like a small bronze amulet. It's shaped like an ant, though whether it was meant as reverence or warning is unclear. A nearby carving suggests worship, or at least awe. The ants are shown mid-stride, almost proud, their antennae raised like laurel wreaths. You settle onto a sun-warmed rock and let the scene fade around you. Insects buzz. A grasshopper launches itself with all the grace of an olive dropped from a cart. You breathe in dusty thyme and the distant salt of the sea. A quirky footnote to all this? Some ancient writers claimed the Myrmidons were so ant-like that they didn't farm like normal people. They foraged, lived on dried grain and honey, stored in neat little underground chambers. Of course, this could just be poetic embellishment, or the result of someone watching ants too long and projecting wildly. Still, the imagery lingers. These weren't just warriors. They were a culture built on discipline, communal survival, and probably a wildly intense work ethic. No late sleepers in a Myrmidon village. You'd be woken by synchronized footfall and a quiet reminder that idle hands anger Zeus. And if you look closely enough at the fields, some say on certain still mornings you can see tiny straight lines traced in the dew. Ghostly trails of long-departed boots, or something even smaller. The morning sun creeps across the plain like it has nowhere better to be. You stretch your legs, still sore from dream-walking through myths, and you make your way down a slope toward a ruined wall half swallowed by vines. A mosaic peeks through the greenery, rows and rows of men with bug-like symmetry standing at attention under a divine thunderbolt. This, you realize, was once a palace courtyard, the kind that might have belonged to Aeacus himself. The king left with no people, no peasants, no plumbing apprentices, just an empty city and a prayer on his lips. And in this part of the myth, you get a better sense of what desperation smells like. Picture it, Aegina, once lively and loud with lyres and goat complaints, now eerily silent. A plague sent by Hera because, as we've established, she never misses a grudge opportunity, swept through and left nothing but wind echoing in clay pots. The priests had vanished, the bakers gone mid-loaf. Even the dogs had packed up and wandered off, presumably to a less vengeful island. Aeacus wandered the temple steps, calling to the sky with that mix of humility and thinly veiled "please don't smite me" energy that only truly desperate rulers master. He didn't ask for gold or thunderbolt subscriptions, he just wanted people. Neighbors, taxpayers, someone to argue about fence lines with. You duck into what remains of a granary. The stone bins are empty now, but there's a faint scent of ancient grain, earthy and sweet like forgotten barley. On one wall, a frieze tells the moment. Zeus, seated high, his hand extended over an anthill. The ants below wriggle and twist, their bodies elongating into humans in mid-crawl. One is still half-mandible, which is frankly alarming. But the rest are almost serene, like they've been waiting centuries to be summoned. Aeacus watches from below, arms raised, cloak flapping dramatically because even in myth, you've got to keep your aesthetics sharp. Some modern scholars suggest this moment is layered in metaphor. Ants rising from the dirt equals men born from the land itself. Autochthonous warriors, pure-blooded sons of the soil. And sure, that's poetic. But it also reads like Zeus saw a problem and solved it using whatever was nearby, classic divine improvisation. You wander out again, shoes crunching over time-softened rubble. The path leads you through the remains of a cistern, now dry, its echo chamber silent except for the occasional drip of condensation. You sit on the edge and swing your feet over, like a child listening to bedtime stories that forgot to end with happily ever after. Here's your quirky fact of the hour. The ants of Aegina weren't just any old picnic crashers. According to one lesser-known source, these ants were unusually large, reddish, and rumored to hoard gold. Some writers described them as semi-mythical, almost like furry beetle ants, which begs the question, were these divine ants actually fluffy? Historians still argue whether this detail came from Persian gold-guarding ants. Yes, that was a thing getting folded into the Greek myth like raisins in a very confusing loaf of bread. But regardless of their size or fur texture, the ants did their job. Zeus snapped his fingers or swarmed himself, depending on your narrative flavor, and from the dirt rose a new people, uniform in loyalty, tireless in purpose, grateful perhaps to be people instead of prey. Aeacus must have been thrilled. One day you're mourning a vanished city. The next, your courtyard is full of upright ants offering you clean water and asking how best to align the road bricks. Their eyes might have been a bit too shiny. Their shoulders may be too square. But when your prayers are answered in the form of insectogen citizens, you don't ask too many questions. You pass what remains of a council hall. The stone benches are still in a semicircle. A scattering of old ceramic game pieces lies abandoned nearby. You kneel and touch one, a faint etching of an ant stamped on the back. Were these pieces used in games, in ceremonies, or were they tokens of pride, tiny reminders that even from a plague, a city can crawl back into existence? You lie back in the grass, letting your fingers trace spirals into the dirt. The clouds overhead drift lazily, and for a moment one almost looks like a man made of ants, reclining on a thundercloud. Or maybe it's just sleep pressing at your eyelids. Either way, the wind hums quietly through the reeds, and the Myrmidons march on just beneath your thoughts. The sun climbs higher now, washing the ancient stones in gold. You find a path winding into a grove of tall pines, and their shadows stretch long like fingers pointing forward. The air smells sharp and clean, sap warm bark, crushed herbs underfoot. Somewhere nearby, the buzz of insects rises again, not angry, not insistent, just organized. And you realize you're not alone. In the stillness, a line of ants is moving across a rock, each one carrying something, a crumb, a twig, a flower petal half their size. Their procession is mesmerizing. There's no leader barking orders, no frantic scurrying, just quiet, relentless cooperation. That's when you feel it, that unmistakable sensation of being watched by something very small with excellent teamwork skills. Zeus, the great cloud slinger, is crouched nearby, figuratively speaking. You don't see him, but in this chapter of your drowsy myth wander, you sense him. Watching ants the way a mortal watches stars, curious, bemused, probably thinking, could I? Here's the thing, Zeus didn't often act without flair. If he wanted a storm, he brought a hurricane. If he wanted love, he wrote a novella about it and cast himself in the lead. But here, in the land of Aegina, he sits cross-legged on the slope of a hill, elbows on his knees, watching ants. It's such a strangely gentle moment. One of the few times the king of the gods solves a problem without fire, fury, or an inappropriate animal disguise. Instead, he leans in, touches the earth, and whispers to it. The ants freeze, antennae twitch, and then slowly they begin to change. At least that's what the oldest storytellers claim. Some fringe interpretations insist Zeus didn't just watch them, he became them. That, in a moment of divine curiosity, or maybe an accidental slip from Olympus, he scattered his essence into 1,000 tiny legs and crawled through the anthill to experience mortal life from the ground up. Historians still argue whether this variant ever existed in early myth, or whether it was the result of one poet's hallucinogenic olive oil experiment. Either way, it gives you something to imagine as you walk beneath the trees. You reach a clearing where boulders have been arranged in a rough circle. The grass between them is tamped down, by weather or feet, you're not sure. You settle onto one of the stones and close your eyes, picturing it. Zeus in full swarm form, crawling over pebbles, dodging raindrops, feeling gravity from below instead of above, watching the world as a thing that can squish you. It's oddly humbling. And when he reforms, man-shaped again, lightning tucked neatly under his belt, he does so with a new understanding. The ants were never random, they were a perfect base. Loyal, quiet, precise, not human yet, but close enough in the right places. So he reaches down again, not as a swarm this time, but as a god, and lifts them. Gently, one by one, until the hill crawls not with insects but with men. They stand slowly, still unsure how to balance on two legs. Some blink at the sun. Some stretch as though trying out muscles they didn't have a moment ago. None speak. That comes later. First, there is simply being. Being men instead of ants. You open your eyes. The clearing hasn't changed. The stones still sit in their quiet ring dappled with sunlight. But there's something different in the air now, like a breath held, then released. Like a memory finally settling into the ground. And there's one more curious note. A few ancient writers mention that the Myrmidons in their earliest days retained certain ant-like habits. They preferred underground homes. They worked best in teams. Some even claimed they spoke in clipped, rhythmic phrases, almost like marching orders. Whether true or not, the image sticks. A race born of insects but molded into warriors. Humble beginnings, perhaps, but destined for myth. The wind shifts, carrying with it the scent of rosemary and pine resin. You get up, brush off your tunic, and follow the path forward. Each footstep lands with gentle purpose, like an ant in the long line of history. You reach a wide plateau, warm underfoot and humming with stillness. The kind of place where myths like to stretch out and settle in for a nap. And here, beneath a sky the color of worn pottery, you witness the moment of transformation. Not metaphor, not symbol, but full-on divine metamorphosis. 1 minute ants, the next men. It happens gradually, which is oddly considerate for a myth. You half expect lightning bolts or celestial drum rolls, but no. Just a shimmer in the air like heat over stone and a slow shifting of shape. The ants begin to swell, not grotesquely but smoothly, as though someone's gently pulling them out of a too-tight mold. 6 legs split into 2 arms and 2 legs. Mandibles soften into jaws capable of speech, eventually. Their eyes change too, from compound kaleidoscopes to something recognizably thoughtful. You sit down on a ledge to watch. They don't panic, no screaming, no what have we become dramatics. These are ants after all, born for duty, not existential crises. They stretch, test the wind, examine one another like soldiers checking for loose armor straps. And then they form a line. Of course they do. Zeus, somewhere above or within or simply amused, watches his creations with paternal pride. He's done it. Not a flood. Not a golden rainstorm of fertile nonsense, just a clean ant-to-man conversion. He's nailed the brief. And Aeacus, he weeps, because now in the valley below stands an army of silent men, sun-baked and barefoot, ready to rebuild his city without asking for lunch breaks. This is the birth of the Myrmidons. You wander among them, careful not to break their tidy formation, and observe their curious symmetry. They are all roughly the same height. Their hair is dark and clipped short. Their faces unreadable yet serene. There's no bickering, no eye-rolling, just quiet solidarity. And here's your mainstream historical fact for the hour. In later Homeric epics, the Myrmidons are famed for their loyalty to Achilles, the Greek hero who led them into battle during the Trojan War. Their ant-born origins became a convenient shorthand for discipline. Fight like the Myrmidons meant unshakable unity. Which is charming until you realize they're also totally cool with dying en masse if a strong-jawed commander says so. You win some, you lose your autonomy. Now for a fringe tidbit. There's a little-known fragment, likely poetic embellishment, that claims the Myrmidons had no need for spoken orders. They could read one another's intentions like ants do through a kind of pheromone-based intuition. Some even whispered that their helmets contained scented herbs to mimic the old ways. Historians still debate whether this was ancient poetic license or just a confused metaphor gone rogue, but the idea of a soldier catching a whiff of sage and instinctively flanking left, unforgettable. You approach a Myrmidon as he sharpens a spear. Yes, already. The ant memory dies hard. The stone blade gleams, shaped not for war, but for hunting dinner or maybe whittling the corners off unsettling furniture. He doesn't speak, but he gives you a nod. It's polite, efficient, very ant. You take a seat nearby, watching as more of them gather and begin to sort tasks. No shouting, no lists. Someone starts a cooking fire. Another begins stacking stones for a shelter. A third appears to be teaching ants, yes, regular ants, how to walk in tighter formation. Old habits die hard. By sundown, a miniature village has appeared. Just a few huts and a grain bin, but it's enough. Enough to prove that Zeus, by turning insects into men, didn't just solve a problem, he created a people. The stars blink into the darkening sky and the air turns cool. You lie back on the warm stone, the sounds of flint tapping and quiet footsteps drifting around you. A myrmidon whistles, a low, tonal tune, oddly like the wind through dry grass. You can't help but wonder if they dream of dirt, of tiny tunnels and sun-warmed pebbles, if under their calm stares they sometimes miss the simplicity of 6 legs and one purpose. But then again, perhaps they don't miss anything at all. Perhaps like true ants or true warriors they simply are, present, efficient, exactly what they were made to be. And in the hush of twilight, the line between man and ant seems comfortingly thin. You wake to the smell of roasted chestnuts and the faint rustle of reeds swaying in the breeze. A low sun filters through morning haze, casting everything in that strange gold that makes the ordinary look sacred. The Myrmidon camp is already bustling, quietly of course. No shouts, no bickering, not even the obligatory morning yawn sighs of people pretending to be awake. Just swift, efficient movement. You shuffle into the camp barefoot. No one minds. They nod at you the way ants nod, probably. You're still not sure if that's a thing. Breakfast is being served, flatbread with wild thyme, goat cheese wrapped in fig leaves, and something resembling honey water. You're handed a bowl before you ask. The Myrmidons don't need permission to help. As you sit, you begin to notice a curious thing. Their manners are impeccable. One man sneezes just once, gently, and another hands him a woven cloth without a word. A small boy drops his olive, 2 others immediately form a triangle to guard it until it's picked up. Plates are passed clockwise. No one reaches, no one spills. It's not eerie, it's oddly soothing, like watching a forest operate, like a perfectly tuned wind chime orchestra. You realize you're witnessing the real personality of the Myrmidons. They're not just warriors, not just former ants. They are deliberate, precise, considerate in a way that feels ancient and communal. They don't waste time or resources or emotion unless it's useful. This brings us to etiquette Myrmidon style. They don't speak much. When they do, it's short, clear, but not rude. There's an old story probably invented by a poet who'd been rejected by a particularly taciturn soldier that claimed Myrmidons never used metaphors, that they found riddles distasteful. Why cloak meaning, one supposedly said, when meaning is already hard enough to carry? You're not sure if that's true, but it fits the vibe. You notice another thing as you sip your honey water. Myrmidons don't sit until the eldest does. It's not ceremonial, it's just right. Like how ants won't build unless the queen gives a scent signal. This is their version of that, respect coded into muscle memory. And here's your mainstream historical fact for the section. In later traditions, the Myrmidons' discipline was legendary. Ancient generals invoked their name when drilling troops, and their formation, tight, shield to shield, seamless, was studied by those hoping to instill order in more chaotic men. Fight like a Myrmidon wasn't about violence, it was about coherence. Now for your quirky detail. There are fragments of Athenian satire that suggest the Myrmidons were so coordinated, they even chewed in unison. A playwright, mocking their stoic demeanor, once described a scene where a Myrmidon choir bit into apples at the exact same moment, producing what he called a thunderous crunch that startled even the gods. Probably an exaggeration. Probably. Historians still argue whether these satirical depictions were a critique of blind loyalty or just ancient comedians doing what comedians do best, poking at the overly serious. Either way, they left an impression. The kind of people who don't flinch, don't fuss, and definitely don't double dip. You finish your meal and walk through the rows of huts. They're tidy, minimal, everything in its place. You spot a helmet being polished, not for vanity, but because a smear would ruin its balance in the line. That's the kind of logic that rules here. Not fashion, not ego, just function. There's a moment that stays with you. A child trips while carrying a basket of grain. He doesn't cry, he just sits. Quiet, 3 others approach. They don't scold or fuss. They sit with him, and together they start sorting the spilled grains back into the basket, one at a time. No one speaks, but everything's understood. This is what happens when you build men from ants. You lie back in the grass, arms behind your head, and listen to the soft cadence of footsteps. Not marching, not yet, just being, deliberate and peaceful. And you think maybe we all have a little Myrmidon in us. That part that longs for order, for calm, for things to make sense even when they don't. You leave the camp in the soft blue hour before dusk, when shadows stretch long and thin, like the fingers of tired gods. The Myrmidons continue their careful routines behind you, sorting firewood by length, drawing water in perfect rotations, sharpening spears until they hum. But tonight, you're chasing lineage. You follow a worn goat path into the hills above the camp, where olive trees grow slanted by wind and old myths. Here, the air is quiet in a different way, older, heavier, like it remembers everything. And it should, because tucked between these stones is the ancestral spark that would one day lead to a boy named Achilles. Yes, that Achilles. You pause beside a crooked column toppled ages ago. Moss climbs it like ivy with ambition, and a faint carving near the base catches your eye. It's a sandal, not a god's winged type, just an ordinary round-toed military one. Beneath it, etched in tiny, tidy letters, is the name Peleus, the father of Achilles and a Myrmidon. The stories say Peleus was a great warrior in his own right, valiant, respected, and likely able to build a trireme with one hand tied behind his back, or so the bards would have you believe. He was adopted into the Myrmidon ranks not by birth, but by honor. He led them, lived with them, trained beside them until they saw him as one of their own. And from Peleus came Achilles, the half-mortal, half-sulky teen hero of the Trojan War. You find a stone bench at the edge of a steep overlook. From here, you can see the glint of the campfires below, flickering in lines like fireflies on parade. And you begin to trace the genealogy in your mind. Ant's right arrow Myrmidons, right arrow Peleus, right arrow Achilles. From mandibles to moody gods, all in a few generations. Achilles may not have had 6 legs or a love for communal grain sorting, but the traits carried over. Loyalty, precision, fearlessness. When he marched to Troy with his ant-born soldiers, he carried with him not just weapons, but legacy. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In Homer's Iliad, the Myrmidons were among the fiercest and most elite warriors in the Greek army. Known for their discipline and unquestioning loyalty to Achilles, they fought not for glory or riches, but for him, a living embodiment of collective focus. And now for the weird bit. There's an obscure version of the myth, found in a dusty Aegean fragment, that suggests Achilles himself inherited traits from the ants. Not the 6 legs, sadly, but the rest. Supposedly, he slept very little, had an unusual ability to sense vibrations through the ground, and brace yourself, could eat 7 times his weight in barley stew without slowing down. Historians still argue whether this was a poetic exaggeration, a symbolic echo of his insect ancestry, or just Homer's version of saying, "This kid eats a lot." Regardless, it raises an interesting question. How much of the Myrmidon is still in Achilles? You picture him as a child, before the war, before the armor, before the heel thing, sitting with his father and learning how to sharpen a blade. Not with bravado, but with calm repetition. The same rhythm ants might use to chew leaves. Chop, swipe, rotate. You wander along the hilltop, where trees whisper gossip into the night. A cicada clicks near your ear, and for a moment you feel like the past is tapping you on the shoulder. Then in the distance, a soft drumming, bare feet maybe, or just memory. You close your eyes and picture it, an unbroken chain from the first ant Zeus blessed all the way to the shores of Troy. A line of loyalty marching across time. Compact, silent, resolute. Ants made men, men made myth, and one moody teen with a really unfortunate tendon made legend. You smile, stretch, and lie back on the warm stone bench. Above you, the stars are aligning into strange shapes. One of them almost looks like a tiny helmet. The stars keep you company through the night. One twinkles more than the others. It could be a distant god or just a sleepy planet, but you nod to it anyway. A soft breeze carries the scent of fennel and baked earth, and you follow it down a winding path into the deeper part of the story. You've seen Zeus turn ants into men once, but here, that's where things get suspicious. You reach a hollow carved between 2 boulders where an old priest once painted scenes of divine interference, and not just in Aegina. No, this version suggests something different. It suggests Zeus may have pulled the ant trick again. There's a cracked fresco here, faded but still readable by moonlight. It shows a different island with different people, smaller in number but drawn in the same symmetrical lines. And at the center, a swarm. Again, ants rising into human shapes, this time beneath a different sun. You crouch and squint. This is Aegina. This isn't even Thessaly. It might be somewhere in Euboea or a lost cyclotic outpost. Hard to tell. What matters is that the shape of the myth has repeated. You whisper it aloud, ants again. The stones seem to whisper back, Yes, ants again. According to a fringe strand of mythological gossip, passed from sailor to sailor like fermented fish stew, there was another plague on another island. And another lonely ruler, same desperation, same prayer, same hill full of ants, and once again Zeus obliges. Was he recycling ideas? Was this his signature move? Oh, you've got no people, let me check the local anthill real quick. Historians still argue whether this supposed second transformation was a parallel myth, an offshoot, or simply a poetic echo created by different communities claiming the same miracle. Some even suggest that Zeus didn't do it. Hermes did, as a test run while Zeus was napping. You sit beside the fresco and imagine the scene. A new hill, a new prayer, and ants lifting into human shape like dancers shrugging off heavy coats. But this time, something's different. This variant myth claims the second batch of ant-men were not warriors. They were builders, tilers, carvers, people who created instead of conquered. They left behind no war songs, just neat canals and strange stone paths that haven't worn down even after centuries. You peer down at your feet and realize the stones beneath you match the ones in the fresco. Smooth, square, too perfectly cut for the region, a whisper of architecture left behind by a second swarm. You lie down and rest your head on one of the cooler stones, letting the myth ripple around you. Maybe Zeus had a soft spot for ants. Maybe he was fascinated by their silence, their focus, their refusal to complain. Or maybe, just maybe, he saw in them something the gods envied, unity without ego, purpose without drama, a whole community that didn't need temples or offerings, just time and a job to do. That's worth repeating, right? Another curious fragment from a minor Corinthian oracle suggests that the ant transformation was part of a cycle. That every few hundred years the gods would look down, see chaos, and rather than send fire or floods, would quietly release another handful of ant-men into the world. Builders, soldiers, bakers, whatever was needed. You smile at the idea. The world saved not by heroes or monsters, but by little clusters of thoughtful workers just getting things done. No lightning bolts, no bronze-clad epics, just clean lines and freshly dug wells. You close your eyes and picture a swarm, quiet, precise, gathering in the corners of forgotten cities. Ants becoming people, again and again. Not to wage war, but to fix things. Dawn creeps in like a shy cat, pawing softly at the horizon. The sky is a pale blue stew of mist and lemon light, and the world smells like damp stone and fennel blossoms. You rise slowly from your stone bed, joints clicking in solidarity with the ancient myths you're tracing. Time to tackle the big question. Why ants, though? Of all the creatures scuttling around ancient Greece, why did Zeus look down at a hill of ants and think, yes, these will do nicely? You head into a shady grove, olive trees bowing gently overhead. Their leaves shimmer in the morning breeze, flickering like whispers. And beneath one particularly wide trunk, you find an old stone bench, half buried but smooth and inviting. You sit, you think. You try not to scratch, because the more you think about ants, the more phantom ants start marching up your arms. Let's explore the options. Ants as symbols of loyalty. That one's easy. Ants work together, often without clear leadership. They build, defend, store food, and sacrifice themselves for the colony. For a god trying to rebuild a population or inspire a military culture, that's pure gold. Ants as born from the earth. In many Greek traditions, being autochthonos, born from the very soil, meant you were pure. You had a sacred claim to the land, unlike foreigners or colonists. Ants constantly tunneling and emerging from dirt were a walking or marching metaphor for that very concept. Ants as observers. There's a poetic theory, okay, more like ancient fan fiction, that ants see everything. That they move invisibly among gods and mortals, carrying messages and secrets back to the roots of the world. Whether that's a bard's embellishment or just a really committed ant lover's fantasy, we'll never know. Historians still argue whether the ant symbolism was a deeply spiritual choice or simply a clever workaround. The island's population is gone. No problem, just animate the bugs. You stretch your legs, letting your toes dig into the soil. The ants around here don't seem especially magical. One's dragging a breadcrumb twice its size. Another is valiantly attempting to scale your sandal. You cheer it on silently. There's something humbling about watching them. Not dramatic, not flashy, but determined. Now here's your quirky fact for the hour. In certain rural parts of ancient Greece, ants were believed to carry the souls of the dead, particularly warriors who hadn't received proper burial. It was considered good luck to step around an anthill, not over it, lest you interrupt someone's journey back to Hades. You glance at the ground. Suddenly that pile of dirt feels like a sacred intersection. As your thoughts wander, so does your gaze upward to the tree branches, where cicadas hum like sleepy prophets. They've probably been around since the ants were men. You can almost hear Zeus now, lounging on a storm cloud, grinning at the absurdity of it all. You want new people? How about ants? And Aeacus, tired, heartbroken, hopeful, would have said, "Sure, I'll take them." And thus was born a society built on humility and coordination. The kind of people who would never interrupt, never grandstand, never write long, melodramatic poems about their exploits, looking at you, Odysseus. The Myrmidons weren't just a handy fix. They were an ideal. What if society worked like this? What if we all did our jobs, didn't complain, and stacked the amphory with the handles facing outward for once? You smile to yourself. It's oddly comforting. As you rise to leave, your hand brushes a small, clay amulet hidden beneath a tuft of dry moss. It's ant-shaped, again. Someone somewhere thought it was worth carving. Not a lion, not an eagle, an ant. Because even in a world of monsters and miracles, sometimes the smallest creature carries the biggest story. The road slopes gently downhill, and you follow it with the sort of aimless purpose the Myrmidons might have admired. It winds past vineyards gone wild, past toppled altars overrun with lizards, past olive trees so old their bark seems to whisper gossip about the gods. As you walk, the path narrows into a causeway overlooking the sea. It's here that the ancient beach town of Aegina once flourished. Today, it's a quiet skeleton of its former self, just a few stubborn foundations, sea-worn statues, and a half-collapsed fish market now colonized by moss and memory. But this stretch of coastline carries an old weight. You feel it in your knees, in your breath, in your fingertips brushing the air. This is where the plague came. It wasn't a coughing, feverish, nose-blowing affair. This was mythological pestilence, sharp, fast, and terrifying, Hera's fury incarnate. The way the stories tell it, you'd wake up one morning to find your neighbor's house silent, then the next house, then the whole street, and soon there'd be nothing left but the wind through empty amphory and an eerie hum you swear was chanting. The plague was supposedly divine, but it behaved like bad seafood. Fast, brutal, unapologetic. The cause? Hera's jealousy, of course. The poor mortals caught in her crossfire had the misfortune of being born in a place Zeus once romantically renamed after a girlfriend. Classic Olympus drama. You sit on a stone bench by what used to be a well. The bucket's long gone, but you can still hear the ghost of a splash if you lean in close. The villagers here begged for answers. The priests tried everything. Burnt offerings, sacrificed goats, even painting their doorways with garlic and sea brine. Nothing worked. Eventually, Aeacus, the same old king, heartbreak still stitched into his bones, knelt in the square and begged Zeus not for vengeance, but for renewal. And now, centuries later, you can still feel that echo. The plea beneath the clouded sky, the stillness between prayers, the silence of a town with no footsteps. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Ancient cities really did face waves of plagues, many blamed on divine punishment. In particular, the plague of Athens during the Peloponnesian War, 430 BCE, was devastating and often associated with divine wrath, even though it was more likely typhoid or smallpox. And here's your offbeat detail. In some rural Greek villages, fishermen believed that curing plague involved tricking the gods. They'd stage fake weddings or host loud banquets, trying to convince the heavens they were thriving, not dying. Whether that fooled the gods or just lifted morale, we'll never know. Historians still argue whether the plague in Aegina was purely mythological or a faint echo of a real event. A town emptied by illness and filled again by story. But here's where it gets peculiar. As the story goes, after the Myrmidons arrived, after Zeus pulled his ant magic stunt, the land healed. Not just the people, but the fields, crops grew straighter. Wells ran sweeter. Even the goats bleated in harmony, allegedly. You stand and wander toward the water's edge. The sand is warm and pale, scattered with tiny shells. A crab eyes you suspiciously and retreats beneath a slab of marble. It's hard to imagine plague here now with everything so quiet and bright. But maybe that's the point. Myths wrap pain in poetry. They take something raw and terrifying, like a town dying overnight, and layer it with gods and ants and rebirth. Because what's easier to believe? That your village was destroyed by invisible sickness, or that it was emptied so Zeus could refill it with perfect, loyal men who never forgot to sweep the temple steps. You sit down and let the tide wash over your feet. Whatever the truth was, the myth remains. A town flattened by divine wrath, reborn through ants and prayers, and remembered in soft, golden silence. You leave the shoreline behind, feet still damp with salt and myth, and wind your way inland toward higher ground. The path takes you through a cypress grove, the trees swaying like they know something you don't. And they do. They've been around since long before sandals had laces and gods had personality cults. You climb slowly, your breath sinking with the hush of the breeze. At the summit, you find a marble platform overlooking the Aegean, a place where the sky always seems to be performing. And at the center of it all, carved into the rock in big, loopy letters, "Here Hera was so over it." You've arrived at Olympus. Well, not the Olympus, but a mortal hilltop version of it, one of many across the ancient world where humans imagine the gods gathered like celestial bureaucrats, divvying up fates and plotting questionable love affairs. And here the story gets delightfully petty. You recline against a sun-warmed stone and peer upward. Imagine it, the sky swirling in godly irritation. Hera, queen of the heavens, wife of Zeus, long-suffering participant in his endless parade of magical shenanigans, is not thrilled about this ant stunt. She's already furious that Zeus renamed a whole island after his latest flame, Aegina. Then he has the nerve to repopulate said island, not with celestial beings or noble heroes, but ants. Ants, Hera mutters, pacing across a cloud. He couldn't even pick birds this time, at least swans had grace. Some myths claim Hera tried to sabotage the transformation mid-process. Gave a few of the ants extra legs, messed with their symmetry, made one allergic to sunlight. The result? A handful of slightly confused Myrmidons who later took up pottery instead of war. You smirk. Here's your mainstream mythological fact. Hera was often portrayed as vengeful in Greek lore, especially when it came to Zeus's affairs and illegitimate offspring. From Hercules to Dionysus, her wrath was legendary and often creatively inconvenient. Now for your quirky tidbit. A fragmentary poem from an island bard describes Hera creating a rival race of insect people, beetle-born, clad in chitinous armor, and fueled by passive aggression. There's no archaeological evidence for these beetle folk, of course, but you really want it to be true. Historians still argue whether Hera's role in this myth was intentionally softened over time, or if she just had better divine PR than most. Either way, she ends up watching from afar, eyes narrowed, arms crossed, as the Myrmidons flourish. Imagine her expression when Achilles is born, the golden child of a lineage born from ants, a war hero rising not from Olympus, but from a hill of dirt. Back on your hilltop perch, you trace a finger across the marble. Someone once etched a tiny figure here, a woman with a crown and a thunderbolt clenched like a soup ladle. Hera? Maybe just an artist's way of saying, even the gods have days when they want to throw something. You lie back, letting the breeze whisper over you. It's easy to forget that even in myths, power comes with irritation. That gods, for all their strength, get fed up too. That Hera might have sighed and muttered, "Fine, let him have his little ant army, but don't expect me to babysit." The clouds drift lazily above. One of them looks like a swarm. Another looks like a woman with very sharp eyebrows. And beneath it all, the Myrmidons keep marching, calm, efficient, unswayed by celestial drama. Because that's the thing about being born from ants. You don't have time for gossip. The air up here has changed, warmer, denser, with the scent of pine pitch and old incense. The path begins to slope down again, and you follow it through a patch of thyme and stubborn wildflowers. Every now and then you catch a whiff of something, smoky maybe, or just old stories baked into stone. At the bottom of the path is a quiet village, or at least the ghost of one. It's mostly foundations now and a few standing columns, but there's something very alive about it. You see carvings on every surface, lintels, paving stones, broken amphorae, not of gods or heroes, but of ants. Some are stylized, 6 tidy lines with dot heads. Others are elaborate like tiny parades. Some have human legs and ant heads, or vice versa. Clearly, this town had an artist with both imagination and insomnia. And it hits you, this wasn't just a one-time tale. This wasn't a bedtime story whispered once and forgotten. This stuck. You walk into what must have been the agora, the central square. There's a sunken mosaic in the middle, half covered in dust and pebbles. You kneel down and brush it gently with your sleeve. It shows the Myrmidons marching in formation, each man nearly identical, their shields etched with what look like mandibles. They're walking toward a temple, and that temple has ants crawling up its sides, not real ones, but carefully painted spirals that mimic the movement of a swarm. You stare at it a little too long, and your vision goes wobbly. The myth morphed, it spread. Because stories are like ants, too. Persistent, communal, willing to crawl under every closed door. You hear voices, faint ones, not threatening, old women maybe, or echoes. They're repeating the myth, but differently this time. Now it's not just Aegina, now it's other islands, other hills. The ant people appear wherever plagues have taken hold, wherever prayers have gone unanswered. Zeus sends them like gardeners of fate. They arrive silently, build efficiently, and disappear just as quietly when the work is done. Historians still argue whether this expansion of the myth was due to oral storytelling roots, political propaganda, or the simple human need to explain why some villages rebuilt faster than others. But here's your quirky detail. In at least one surviving scroll, badly burned, found in the ruins of a seaside villa, there's a passage claiming that Myrmidons could recognize each other generations later by scent alone. No birthmarks, no crests. Just a familiar, dusty earth smell passed down like an inheritance. You wander past an old oven, half collapsed, but still blackened from fire. Someone cooked here. Someone baked barley bread with sesame and olive oil, and maybe whispered the story of how the first bakers had once had 6 legs and lived underground. The myth was retold, but it also changed. In some places, Zeus sends ants. In others, the ants rise up themselves, unprompted, and become human to save the land. In one version, the Myrmidons don't march at all, they sing. In another, they dissolve back into ants after the city is stable. You pause at a temple ruin and notice a new carving. Not ants this time, it's people, hands linked, dancing in a spiral. The inscription reads, "Born of the earth, we remember the rhythm." You close your eyes. You imagine the story passed down over generations, shaped by tongues and dialects, twisted slightly by each teller's quirks. A god's odd experiment becomes a cultural touchstone. A curious metaphor turns into ritual, maybe even worship. Because here's the thing, people love a story that explains how order can come from chaos, how something tiny can build something massive, how ants can become men. And maybe they love it even more when it changes, when it becomes their own. The trail you're following leads through tall grasses now, the kind that hiss and sway in long, sleepy waves. You feel like you're walking inside a lullaby. The sun leans lower, the shadows stretch, and the golden hour begins its quiet song. Ahead, a circle of stones marks what once was a gathering place. Not for war councils, not for divine proclamations, for something simpler. A picnic. Yes, the Myrmidons had those too. You settle into the warm dust near a set of flat stones worn smooth by countless seated rears. Clay cups are stacked nearby, simple, handmade, and decorated with ants again. But this time they're smiling, possibly, or maybe it's just how their mandibles are shaped. You squint. And then you hear it, laughter. Not booming, not raucous. Just low chuckles, murmurs, the kind of sound you'd hear at a well-managed reunion. You're late to the party, but the Myrmidons don't mind. They hand you a fig, someone slicing honey cakes. There's even wine, diluted, of course. These are antecedent people, not animals. The air is rich with the smell of oregano, charred lamb, and that particular kind of baked dust that only appears after a long, hot afternoon. It's the smell of rest, of earned stillness. Here's the thing, these people aren't robots. They're not humorless drones. They're just intentional, everything done with purpose, even joy. You watch as 2 of them carefully unfold a linen cloth. Not a wrinkle, every corner aligned like military geometry. They place olives in a perfect circle. Bread slices in a spiral. You half expect the food to start singing in rounds. And yet it's peaceful, not forced. There's comfort in the order. One of the elders, skin like wrinkled parchment, catches your eye. He's chewing slowly, reverently on a skewer of grilled onion and something that might be goat. He nods toward the cloth. You realize the folding isn't about obsession. It's about ritual. It's their way of saying, this moment matters. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In many ancient cultures, especially in Greece, communal meals were sacred, not just for nourishment, but for bonding, celebration, and memory. The act of eating together was seen as almost divine, a way of maintaining civic harmony. Now for your quirky tidbit. There's an obscure pottery shard in a museum somewhere that shows a Myrmidon picnic, not a battle. They're depicted passing grapes, not javelins, and one of them appears to be playing a flute for a lizard. Scholars still debate whether it's satire, but you like to believe it's real. Historians still argue whether the Myrmidons were truly humorless, or if their mythic seriousness was just Homer's dramatic flourish. After all, who'd want to write an epic poem about a group of warriors who spent half their time inventing symmetrical napkin folds? But here, tonight, in this sun-drenched glade, you know the truth. They laughed, softly maybe, rarely, but they did. They even told jokes, just very precise ones, probably with footnotes. Someone offers you a boiled egg wrapped in grape leaf. You accept it clumsily. The Myrmidon beside you smiles, not mockingly, patiently, like a teacher amused by an eager student. The meal winds down, the fire embers glow. And as twilight folds over the land like a soft blanket, someone starts humming. It's not a war song, it's something older, maybe an anthem to patience, to rebirth, to ants who dared to stand up and say, "We're here now." You lie back and let the sounds blur together. Crackling wood, chewing murmured toasts, one off-key flute. A warrior brushes crumbs from his tunic and tucks his plate under a log. And you think, maybe greatness doesn't always come with trumpets. Sometimes it comes with a well-folded napkin. The moon has risen now, round and soft, casting silver puddles across the path as you leave the warmth of the picnic behind. The trees are hushed, the Myrmidons settling into quiet routines, dousing the embers, straightening bowls, drawing water with the precision of priests. Even their sleep, you suspect, is perfectly arranged, dreams lined up like sandals outside a barracks. You follow a narrow trail lit by moonlight and memory until it leads you to a squat little structure nestled at the base of a rocky slope. Not a temple, not a barracks, it's a gallery of sorts. You step through the threshold and into the still, dust-heavy air of a forgotten space. The walls are covered in fragments, clay pots, painted tiles, carved panels, all depicting ants. But this time, the ants aren't marching or transforming. They're everywhere, climbing vines, peering from tree trunks, crouched on helmets, whispering into the ears of kings. You're in the heart of something odd and beautiful, an artistic obsession that spanned generations. One fresco shows ants helping build a temple, dragging stones with ropes. Another has them harvesting olives, wearing tiny aprons. It's adorable and kind of unsettling. There's a vase depicting an ant sitting in council with humans, pointing at a scroll. And here's your mainstream fact. Greek pottery and murals often included mythological motifs, centaurs, gods, monsters, but regional myths like the Myrmidons often made their way into local art. Not always for worship, but to keep the story alive, to root it in daily life. A curious detail, you notice one panel where the ants appear before Zeus arrives. They're shown circling a grove, forming what looks like a face in the dirt. This version implies they called him. Some fringe scholars believe this was the rebel fresco, a heretical version suggesting that the ants themselves had divine agency, that they summoned Zeus, not the other way around, that they wanted to change, to help, to matter. Historians still argue whether these artistic variants were satire, regional flair, or full-on ant theology. But the idea of ants with intentions, with purpose, that lingers. You move deeper into the room, the art gets stranger. Now the ants are interwoven with humans, arms become antennae, faces fade into mandibles. It's not transformation, it's cohabitation. A suggestion that man and ant are not separate but symbiotic, two halves of a forgotten whole. You pause before a massive ceramic urn at the back of the room. It stands taller than you, and etched into it in perfect symmetry is a spiral of Myrmidon faces, each one slightly different yet unmistakably connected. Between each face, an ant. It's oddly hypnotic. You imagine ancient artists here, crouched over stone and clay, trying to express something they couldn't quite explain. That beneath our myths and armor and dinner parties, maybe we're all just trying to follow a scent trail, to do our part, to make order from chaos. The wind moves through the doorway behind you, soft and slow. The smell of crushed sage wafts in. And as you turn to leave, you spot one last carving, a Myrmidon folding a cloak for an ant, tucking it gently over the insect's small frame like a bedtime ritual. You smile. Because that's the thing, the art didn't just preserve the myth, it softened it, humanized it, made space for ants to be more than soldiers, to be caretakers, citizens, companions. You step outside. The moonlight catches on 1,000 tiny shells in the dirt, and for a moment it looks like a trail. You follow it. Not in a hurry, just steady. Like someone who finally understands how to walk in line. The trail of shells vanishes as dawn stains the sky with faint pinks and sleepy oranges. You descend a terraced hill now, soft with dew and dotted with anise and marjoram. Somewhere below, a rooster gives a half-hearted crow, like he's unsure whether to start the day or hit snooze. You reach a small stone courtyard nestled into the hillside, with a fountain that hasn't worked in centuries but still manages to look smug about it. And sitting in the center, legs crossed and hands steepled like he's about to give a TED talk on bug behavior, is an old man with a scroll. He nods as you approach. "I assume you're here for the ant facts," he says without looking up. You blink, "Sure." He smiles faintly. "Let's begin." Because up until now, everything's been myth, metaphor, and mural. But now we let the scientists crash the party. You sit beside him on a slab of warmed stone as he unfurls the scroll, a modern facsimile of knowledge, inked by scholars who have spent too much time watching ants and not enough time in sunlight. Here's your mainstream scientific fact. Ants are eusocial insects, living in complex colonies with distinct roles: workers, soldiers, queens. Their societies are structured, often functioning without centralized leadership. Some colonies span miles underground. Some wage territorial wars. Some even keep aphid livestock for sweet excretions. Yes, that's a real thing. And now, here's the quirky overlap. The Myrmidons, despite their mythic origin, mimic many traits observed in real ants: hierarchy, coordination, collective behavior, and unwavering loyalty. Even their battlefield strategies in Homeric epics resemble ant swarm tactics, group maneuvers over individual bravado. You raise an eyebrow. "So ants invented flank attacks?" The old man shrugs, "More or less." There's even an obscure entomology text, written in the 18th century by a monk with far too much free time. That refers to Myrmidons regulus, or royal ants, describing them as creatures with extraordinary memory, capable of mourning lost colony members by circling the nest in silence. Historians still argue whether this was actual observation, allegory, or just a lonely monk writing poetry under the guise of science. But even modern ethologists have noted parallels. Some species of ants will carry injured comrades back to the nest. Others will leave behind scent trails as warnings, like a tiny Morse code of grief. It makes you wonder, did the Myrmidons inherit not just loyalty but empathy? A breeze shifts the scroll, revealing a hand-drawn map of known ant species. The Aegean region is dotted with notes, sketches, and question marks. Some entries are marked extinct, others undocumented. You glance at the old man. Any chance Zeus left a few unfinished projects? He smiles, not answering. You rise, stretch, and follow a path that winds behind the courtyard. It leads you to a clearing where anthills rise like miniature temples. The sun warms their sides. You crouch beside one, watching a procession of ants carry a fallen wasp not just away, but with care. One stops, touches antennae to another. A silent exchange. And you think, maybe the gods weren't copying ants. Maybe they were learning from them. Maybe when Zeus chose ants to mimic humanity, he wasn't improvising. He was acknowledging the original blueprint, a species that knew how to build, how to serve, how to endure. Not perfect, not flashy, but persistent, adaptable. You stand and look toward the hills beyond, dotted with ruins and wild thyme. You feel in your bones that the line between science and myth is thinner than anyone admits. After all, who's to say ants didn't shape us? You take a final glance at the nest. One ant pauses, looks up. You nod just in case. And walk on. The day warms as you walk, the air thick with bee song and the faint sweetness of overripe figs baking in the sun. You pass a fig tree where someone's hung wind chimes from an old amphora shard. They tinkle lazily in the breeze, like distant applause for myths still doing their job. You find a shady spot near the crest of another hill, because let's be honest, everything in this story involves a hill, and settle on a smooth boulder. Below you, the landscape rolls out like a woven tapestry. Scrubby groves, ruined columns, the sleepy shimmer of the sea. And you ask yourself, why did this myth survive? Why did the story of Zeus turning ants into men, ants, endure for centuries while other, arguably more glamorous tales faded into historical obscurity? Let's dig into that. First, here's your mainstream historical fact. The Greeks weren't just myth spinners, they were curators. They chose which stories to keep, which to tweak, and which to forget. Oral traditions weren't random. They were honed, polished, repeated across generations until they clicked with the culture's values. And the Myrmidon myth, oh, it clicked. Because this tale isn't about conquest or seduction. It's about resilience. It's about a people born from ruin, from plague, from nothing, and rising into unity. A ready-made metaphor for any city rebuilding after disaster, which, in the ancient world, was basically all of them all the time. You lie back against the warm rock. An ant ambles across your sandal, you let it. There's also a matter of prestige. The Myrmidons weren't just any mythic footnote, they were Achilles' crew. And that boy had PR, every city wanted a piece of him. The fact that his troops were supposedly ant-born, that made them unique, distinct, unforgettable. And here's the quirky tidbit of the hour. Some late classical dramatists, especially in Athens, loved to insert Myrmidons into unrelated plays. A character might randomly mention that their neighbor eats like a Myrmidon or folds tunics with insectal precision. It became a shorthand for obsessively tidy, overly loyal, possibly too quiet types. The ancient Greek equivalent of calling someone robotic, but with affection. Historians still argue whether this linguistic survival indicates admiration or mockery. But either way, it's stuck. You don't get referenced in theater unless you've made an impact or seriously annoyed someone in catering. You wander to a grove where small stone steels lean into each other like gossipy old friends. The inscriptions are worn, but a few names are legible. Some have the prefix Miami or Miamido. These were likely descendants, real or imagined, carrying on the ant-born legacy. The story endured not just because of Achilles or Homer or even Zeus. It survived because it filled a gap in the human psyche. It gave people a sense that greatness could come from the tiniest, humblest beginnings. That even if your city was wiped clean, even if your name was forgotten, there was a story where life crawled back up from the dust and rebuilt itself. Quietly. Together. No drama, no thunder. Just a line of patient, purposeful footsteps. And maybe that's why, all these centuries later, you're still walking with them. Because we all want to believe that order can rise from ruin, that the gods are watching, that somewhere out there in the dirt, a new beginning is always possible. You brush your hand over the steel. The stone is warm, solid. The myth is still here, still marching. And so are you. The wind has shifted again, carrying the soft scent of burning laurel and something vaguely herbal, possibly divine cologne, if the gods ever decided on a signature fragrance. You follow the path as it curls like a lazy river through a sunlit valley. And here, just past a grove of myrtle trees, you find an odd little shrine. It's not grand, no towering columns, no gold, just a circle of smooth stones, a few half-burnt offerings, almonds, wine, and a single honeycomb, and in the center a statue barely waist-high. You tilt your head. It's a beetle. No, a dragonfly. Wait, it's a hybrid. A strange, stylized figure with insect wings, human limbs, and a face that's either serene or totally lost in thought. You've just stumbled into a chapter the bards don't like to linger on. Because as it turns out, Zeus wasn't the only god experimenting with insect-based life hacks. You sit on the edge of the shrine and let the whispers of forgotten myths crawl into your ears. Hermes, god of trickery and slightly chaotic ideas, once tried to create a race of messenger beetles. They'd deliver secrets between temples, tiny bug couriers with scrolls strapped to their backs. It didn't go well. According to a very dusty side text, one beetle misdelivered a curse tablet to the wrong city and triggered a minor border skirmish. Then there was Apollo, who allegedly tried to bond with cicadas to invent a new type of temple music. The result? A non-stop 3-day buzzing concert that ended when Hera threw a sandal into the lyre strings. And of course, Dionysus reportedly befriended a swarm of drunken fireflies. He taught them to blink in rhythm to his revels. Whether this was divine invention or just a well-lit party trick is unclear. But here's the weirdest one. A now-lost island myth claims that Artemis once turned an entire grove of nymphs into mayflies, so they could live fast, love briefly, and vanish beautifully at sunset. A poetic catastrophe preserved in exactly one surviving verse. Historians still argue whether these insect myths were local variations, symbolic inventions, or the result of too many wine-soaked evenings in philosophical circles. But there's a pattern. Gods dabbling in insects wasn't uncommon. What made the Myrmidons' story stick was the outcome. Where others failed, messenger beetles, musical cicadas, flirty fireflies, Zeus succeeded. He made something lasting, something orderly, a legacy. You reach into a satchel someone left near the shrine. Inside is a scroll with drawings of various insect humanoids, some winged, some armored, one labeled Thysamacra, extremely speculative. There's even a sketch of a centaur-like creature, only the lower half is a beetle thorax. Yikes! You chuckle softly and roll the scroll back up. It's comforting in a strange way to know that the gods weren't just playing chess with humans. Sometimes they experimented, failed, got weird, and sometimes, accidentally, they created something remarkable. Like a swarm of ants turned into the most disciplined army the world had seen. You glance at the shrine again. Someone left a garland there. It's wilting but still fragrant, woven with mint and thyme. A quiet offering for an insect god who never quite made it into the pantheon. You offer a nod of thanks, just in case. Because in this world, you never know which bug was a blessing in disguise. The valley flattens as you move onward, and the path becomes less a trail and more a quiet suggestion beneath the grass. A few stone slabs mark where a road once ran, centuries ago, back when sandals clacked proudly and wagons groaned under amphory of grain and gossip. But today it's silent, and you walk it alone. Well, almost alone. Because as you round a bend, you hear voices. Not singing, not shouting. Typing. You freeze, one sandal half raised, and there in the shade of an old fig tree sits a group of very modern individuals. A poet with a laptop, a philosopher with a stack of post-its, a comic book writer doodling a hero with ant-like armor and six-pack abs that would make Achilles weep. You've entered the present, and the Myrmidons are still here. Not literally, no one's marching in bronze sandals or polishing spears in unison, but the idea of them, alive and crawling through modern minds like a gentle, ancient itch. The poet looks up and gestures for you to sit. She reads you a stanza, half muttered, half hummed. Born of soil shaped by pain. They did not ask, but rose again, to carry cities on their backs. In silent lines, they left no tracks. It's beautiful and vaguely terrifying. You sip tea from a chipped mug someone hands you, chamomile with a sprig of thyme. No one speaks for a while, they don't need to, the Myrmidons are writing themselves. Here's your mainstream modern fact. In contemporary literature, the term Myrmidon still appears, usually to describe loyal followers, especially ones who obey without question. Sometimes flattering, sometimes sinister. The word has survived even if its origin has not. And here's your quirky tidbit. In a 1980s comic series, there's a superhero named Myrmidons, allegedly descended from an ancient Aegean warrior. His powers, unbreakable discipline, tactical mind, and the ability to lift 50 times his weight, sound familiar. Historians and pop culture critics still argue whether these modern uses respect the original myth or exploit it. But honestly, the line doesn't matter. Because every time someone writes about resilience, unity, or rising from ruin, the Myrmidons march quietly in the background. Maybe in boots, maybe in sneakers, maybe in the margins of a graphic novel or a short story with too many footnotes. You lean against the fig tree and watch as the comic book writer holds up a panel. It shows a storm-drenched city with ant-shaped silhouettes walking through rubble, rebuilding, carrying beams, stacking bricks. The caption reads, "We remember the rhythm." You nod, because somewhere between myth and metaphor, between Homer and hashtags, the Myrmidons made their way into the bloodstream of story itself. They crawled past the temples, through the libraries, and into the quiet parts of our imagination where order still feels possible. They're the patron saints of second chances. The gentle, tireless army that reminds us, even when everything crumbles, you can still pick up the pieces. Slowly, silently, together. You finish your tea, the poet waves goodbye. The philosopher drops a sticky note into your palm. It reads, "Be like the ant, small, quiet, relentless." You smile and tuck it into your pocket. The Myrmidons, it seems, have a new campaign now. Not war, but whispering wisdom across time. Evening returns like a calm tide, brushing soft lavender hues across the sky. You leave the fig tree and your poetic companions behind, descending a slope where grasses sigh and olive branches sway like sleepy metronomes. At the base of the hill lies a small field, flat, circular, surrounded by stones. You recognize it instantly, though you've never seen it before. It's a parade ground. Only no one's parading, not tonight. Instead, the Myrmidons stand in scattered clusters, not in perfect lines, not quite, but almost. Their formation is softer now, the edges blurred by fatigue and reflection. Their shields rest at their sides. Some sit cross-legged in the dust. A few lie back and stare at the stars. You join them. A young soldier offers you a fig, then goes back to polishing his sandals, not for battle, just because. Beside him, an elder hums a tune so low it's more vibration than sound. Across the field, a child draws spirals in the dirt with a stick, pausing now and then to consider the swirl. This is the final rhythm, the slow, gentle heartbeat of a people who have done what they came to do. Here's your mainstream mythological echo. In some later versions of the Trojan saga, after Achilles' death, the Myrmidons didn't follow another leader. Some say they simply vanished, returned to the hills, faded into anonymity. They weren't meant for glory, they were meant for purpose. And when that purpose ended, they didn't chase a new one, they rested. Here's your fringe detail. One obscure text, barely legible on a broken stele near Saunian, claims the Myrmidons asked to be turned back into ants after their final war. That they preferred the quiet, that they missed the soil. Historians still argue whether this was a symbolic death, a metaphor for humility, or a reflection of something deeper. The idea that peace isn't loud, it's tiny, ordered, unseen. You lie on your back, hands behind your head, the cool earth pressing against your spine. The sky above you is velvet black and stitched with stars. And for a moment you imagine you can hear them, tiny feet marching across the cosmos, weaving constellations into formation. Quiet, steady, unshakable. You let out a slow breath. Because this is the rhythm now, not war, not storm. Just silence, and the distant whisper of tiny feet still building. And now, dear traveler, the story slows. The trail fades beneath your feet. The winds hush, the stars dim, and even the ants have curled into their earthy homes, dreaming of grain and quiet purpose. You rest now not in the middle of a myth, but at the edge of it, where fact and fable blend into something soft and untroubled. The hills, once crawling with footsteps and worry, are now tucked beneath a velvet sky. The air is still. The work is done. Let your breath move gently in and out, like the tide that once lapped the shores of ancient Aegina. Let your limbs go heavy, grounded like roots in the soil those first Myrmidons were pulled from. Nothing presses you now. No marching, no gods watching from the clouds, no battles waiting beyond the ridge. Just the warmth of earth beneath you. The gentle rise and fall of your chest. The quiet tick of a story that's told all it needed to tell. You may not be born from ants, but in this moment, this stillness, you understand them. Their patience, their purpose, their peace. And so, as your thoughts drift and dissolve like smoke in moonlight, remember, there is a rhythm to even the smallest life, a cadence to every quiet act, and somewhere, tucked beneath the dust of time, are stories that will march gently on, long after we sleep. Now close your eyes. Let the world shrink. Let the hum fall away. And sleep knowing you walked with ants,